Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast. I hope this episode helps you thrive in life and leadership. And if you like it, hit the like button and subscribe to my channel, and that way you'll never miss a thing. Well, if you're like me, you're always looking for ways to stay informed and engaged with the world around us. And that's why I created On the Rise. It's a curated weekly newsletter packed with thought-provoking articles and insights on faith, culture, and the future of the church, and really any other subject that I find fascinating and conversation worthy. And I send it to you absolutely free every single week. So if you're ready to join the conversation and be part of a community of curious, engaged leaders, you can subscribe to On the Rise today at ontherisenewsletter.com. You can start and stop at any point on ontherisenewsletter.com. This episode is also presented by Glue. Glue is connecting the faith ecosystem in innovative ways. One way is by making it a lot easier for churches to connect with new visitors. Did you know, for example, that the time it takes for a church to respond to new visitors has a major impact on whether that new person or family will stay? Well, with Glue, you can use automation to build engaging new visitor engagement journeys. You can learn how at get.glue.us/visitors. That's get.glue.us/visitors. And now to today's episode. Katelyn, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, so I'll be honest, I told you this before we hit record. I was a little bit skeptical or fearful to pick up your book when I saw Celebrities for Jesus, How Personas, Platforms, and Profits Are Hurting the Church. And I thought it was going to be another hit piece on the church, and I care about church leadership. I don't think it was. What blew me away, and I want to start here because we're going to dissect your thoughts on that, was how much you knew about what is going on inside the head of a pastor, and yet you've never been a pastor, to my knowledge. So do you want to unpack that? Like, how did you read our minds? You nailed it. Like, yes. You really did. As a guy who led a church for 20 years, you seem to be very familiar with the temptations.
Well, a couple thoughts. I'm grateful to start off to hear that the book does not read as a hit piece, because that was not my intention in writing it. In terms of my psychological perceptiveness regarding what pastors are experiencing, I'm thinking of a couple things. My time working at Christianity Today magazine gave me, not a direct experience of church leadership, but observational patterns start to emerge when you're reporting on the church and church leaders, and challenges and temptations that a lot of American church pastors are facing. And so in that regard, I'm writing with a deep sense of compassion, because it is not an easy time to be a pastor.
Correct. Yeah.
And also, I would say perhaps my accurate read on what pastors are experiencing is coming just from the reality that pastors are people. And so while I haven't directly had any kind of church leadership experience, I do know what it's like to be in leadership positions. I do know what it's like to want people to like and respect you and to take you seriously. I know what it's like to want to feel successful in whatever you're doing. So in some ways, maybe it's, these are human problems, not pastor problems. And if any of us were thrust into the spotlight of a dynamic church that's growing or that's struggling, right? Like we would face similar inner emotional, spiritual, psychological challenges.
Well, it's extremely well done. And I mean, it's a little bit, to me, it was reminiscent of the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast now a couple of years ago. Extremely painful and difficult to listen to. But one of the things that really surprised me is, Mark may have been a very extreme example of a lot of those temptations played out on a large scale with a lot of damage in its wake. But I'm like, oh, I know the seed of that. Like, I understand wanting to throw people under the bus. I understand wanting to block off access, and those may have been more seeds than full-grown weeds in my life. But, they were there. And I thought you did a very good job capturing that essence. What is the reaction from pastors who have read the book? Like, what has the reaction been
I'm sure you've gotten everything from 1-star reviews to thank yous.
I've never read any reviews. That's
good
of course
for you.
not true.
Yeah,
That's of course not true. I read reviews just like everybody else.
You and Seth Godin. Okay. Yeah.
I would say probably a lot of readers have come in wondering, okay, is this going to just be a collection of the bad, salacious headlines that we've all seen over the last few years? Well, I don't really want that. I don't want to just kind of spend 200 pages in the muck. So I want something that's more constructive. So I think a lot of readers have felt pleasantly surprised that this isn't just a litany of bad news, but it's let's get past the headlines and look at some of the deeper dynamics within the American church so that we can have a healthier church. You know, I'm writing as someone who loves the church, who has been a part of a church community, since I was very young, and want the church to reflect the beauty of the call that it has been given by the Lord. And so wanting to move toward, I don't know if solution is the right word, because I think we would be naive to think that the problem of celebrity might be addressed in like a 3-point slideshow, right? I think it's a little more complicated than that.
Yep.
But I would say I've been very grateful to have people get to the end of the book and realize, oh, this is coming from a place of love for the church. This isn't biting or bitter, in the ways that some other critiques might be. I would say a critique of the book has been, you don't give us a solution, or you kind of spend so much time analyzing the problem, and I know the problem, or I know the problems. And so I was really hoping to read a book that would tell us how to get beyond this. And I mean, truthfully, I'm not sure that the problem of celebrity in the church is going away anytime soon. I think, in fact, it might be getting worse before it gets better, because it is so deeply ingrained in American culture, American church culture. A lot would have to change for us to kind of pluck out this unhealthy root. That would be one of the main critiques, though, that like, gosh, I want us to get healthier, and you don't tell us how to do that. And maybe you and I, Carey, will get into some, maybe some initial steps for church leaders to think about. But I don't think that the problem of celebrity is kind of immediately solvable, or if we just apply this program, then we'll all be better,
Yeah, I do want to explore that with you, Katelyn, because I think it's a very real issue. And, maybe to use Andy Stanley's language, it's not a problem to be solved, but a tension to be managed. And I think one of the things that was really helpful to me, because you do that, like you seem to understand, I was just thinking we should get Pat Lencioni to write the 5 temptations of a pastor, not just the 5 temptations of a CEO, because he loves church too, like Patrick really does. But you seem to understand the inner psychology of what's going on in a pastor's mind. And I think that in and of itself, when you kind of go, oh, I'm not the only one to have those thoughts. Oh, I'm not the only one to be, have that dark side to me, whether you act on it or not.
Right.
I think that's very helpful to have language around that. So I think that is helpful, but we'll get into solutions. Let's back up a little bit. So historically, because I'm going to argue with you that there is an inevitability to celebrity, and we can have fun debating that. But I want to know how celebrity is different from being well-known or well-respected. So for example, C.S. Lewis, very well-known, very well-respected. Spurgeon, bless you, very well-known, very well-respected. But then there does seem to be a morphing into celebrity. Like, where is, Tim Keller? Is he a celebrity, or is he just well-known or well-respected? Like, where is there a line? Where is that line? How do you carve that out?
Yeah, it's a great question. Early on in this book, I talk about the difference between fame and celebrity. So fame is something, when you talk about someone who is well-liked or well-respected, well, there have been people in every time and place who, because of their leadership accomplishments, in ancient times, their family lineage or military prowess, because of their acts or works in the world, their name carries beyond a specific time and place, and they gain a kind of renown. And this is, of course, true for Christians as it is for anybody else. And, I don't think fame as a byproduct is a problem. If it comes to you unbidden, as a result of something good that you've contributed to your neighbors or to a community or to society, then, as Christians, I would say, well, then you have to figure out how to steward it well. But the fact that you have it, that you have a measure of fame, is kind of neutral, right? And, on the point of these three men who you just named, I would say from afar, all three of them seem to navigate their fame in their lifetime in a healthy, grounded way. And we can talk about why, what might have been going on for them that made that so. Celebrity is really a distinctly modern phenomenon in that it relies on the tools of mass media to project an image of oneself. And so I think with celebrity, not only do you have the screen and the stage and the spotlight and call all the machinery of mass media that can give others an image of yourself that is much more glowy and impressive than you actually are in your normal and fleshed life. But also, celebrity is the thing that is sought for itself. It's not a byproduct per se, but it is, I want to be famous for its own sake. Right. This goes back to a well-known quote from the historian Daniel Boorstin, who was writing in 1962. So this was decades before social media, which has poured jet fuel onto this problem, I would argue. But he, notably said a celebrity is a person who is well known for being well known or famous for being famous. And so he's underscoring that there's an artifice to it. There's something that is manufactured. And I think, for Christians especially, where problems start to creep in, whether we're talking about celebrity or fame, is the lack of proximity, a kind of distance that is created between the persona or the image or the public brand and the person in his or her daily life, kind of who they are behind closed doors or off the screen or off the stage. And when there's a gap there can be all sorts of temptations and lack of integration, right? Like lack of personal integration.
So let's look at Tim Keller. He's a good modern example, alive in our lifetime. Why would you say? And so fame would be, no, I'm not trying to cultivate celebrity. I'm just well known because, I lead a big church, or I've written some books, or I'm a persuasive speaker, or something like that. How would you say that he has stewarded things differently than someone who's pursuing celebrity?
I should say off the top that I don't know Tim Keller personally. And so I am giving impressions from afar.
Mm-hmm. But you don't know most of the people you write about personally, right?
Yes, that is correct. But in terms of assessing someone's spiritual health, I'm like, well, the people who can best reflect on that would be the people who live their lives among Tim Keller, right? As just Tim, not Tim Keller. But having said that, what strikes me about Tim Keller is that he understands or has understood his primary ministry to be to a particular group of people in a particular context, and that ministering to those people, understanding the particularities of his ministerial context, has been his primary desire, is to be a pastor or a shepherd to people. It seems to me that, book deals, speaking engagements, his being a national or international figure came unbidden as a result of Redeemer growing exponentially and then becoming a model for other churches in large, mostly non-Christian cities. So that would be one thing that comes to mind, is that it seems to me that the notoriety came afterward as a result of good ministry, not I'm going to go to New York and become famous as being a pastor, and then kind of whatever ministerial work I do is second fiddle, right? So I would say his priorities have seemed in the right place. The other thing I'll say about Tim Keller, I mean, I said I don't know him personally. I have been on a few Zoom meetings with him over the last couple years, and I don't get the impression from him that he wants to be seen as anybody other than who he is. He's not, I don't get a sense of pretense or airs or I want you to think of me impressive. It just seems like he's willing and able to show up as Tim Keller, which happens to be a very intelligent, thoughtful person who people look up to and respect. But, I think we can tell when we're trying to be impressed or we're being given a presentation of the self. And we all have to show up in specific ways in our jobs and our callings. But I like that Tim Keller just seems like a normal guy, like I can imagine sitting next to him on the subway and not feeling like, oh my gosh, it's Tim Keller. And I appreciate that, despite the fact that he could very easily have leaned into that in his public ministry.
That's very consistent with my experience with him, which is largely through this podcast. I interviewed him in person in New York City right before the pandemic, and then 3 other times via Zoom in the last few years, or a couple of other times in the last few years. And same thing, very grounded, but also like hyper intelligent. I mean, my gosh, that guy has forgotten more than I will ever remember when it comes to theology and history. And, so there is definitely like, oh yeah, he's bringing it. But it just oozes out of who he is, and having read and prayed for 7 decades, then I'm trying to impress you.
Right. I think you're describing something like authenticity.
Yes.
That how someone is showing up, even though they have this big following and name recognition, how they show up with others is authentic.
You make a link in the book between the decline of the church and the rise of celebrity. How do you see the two as connected?
Yeah, well, as you know, and I'm sure you've discussed on this podcast in the past, institutions have significantly declined in Western culture and specifically in American life in the last 50, 60 years in terms of how people affiliate with specific institutions, the loyalty that they feel toward them or trust that they have in them. So all institutions from media, entertainment, business, higher education, and of course the church, they're all facing this crisis of trust. And in the decline of institutional identity and trust is the rise of individual authority and authority figures who people can still rally around and put their trust in and attach to, kind of to understand themselves. My attachment to this person or my trusting this person helps me know who I am and where I belong and what I want to become like. And so, our culture's fascination with celebrities just speaks to this, that we are much more inclined to know the particularities of the lives of people we'll never meet and never know. Like, it's so much more interesting to follow celebrity news than to follow, what's the U.S. state legislator doing this month, or like, what are these big institutions whose work is very slow and boring and procedural, but actually has a profound effect on our shared life. Celebrities are just more interesting. They're more, we're still looking to attach to authority figures, to understand ourselves, to tell us how to live, what to believe, what is good, what is moral. It is just the case that our own identity is more likely to be oriented toward a specific charismatic leader or figure than it is an institution. And I think in the church, the sense just among a lot of churches is that, so much less than denominational identity or even theological identity is the personality and persona of the lead pastor or the pastoral team to kind of set the course for the life and flavor of the church, and that people are in many ways more likely to show up for a particular leader than they are for a particular institutional identity. In some ways, the institutional identity doesn't really matter as long as the leader is, charismatic and powerful and offers that kind of authority.
Yeah, I forget whether you mentioned this in your book, but I've read a couple of accounts recently about sort of the strong man or strong woman theory of history, that as institutions collapse, we're looking for individuals to sweep in and save us. So, our grandparents might have been, well, I'm Episcopalian, or I am Presbyterian or United Methodist, and this happens to be our pastor. Whereas now it's like, oh, here's the pastor. I think we're United Methodist, but I'm not sure. Right? Do you see that trend in our culture and in the church with sort of the strong woman, the strong man replacing the institution?
Yeah, absolutely. And people far smarter than me have written about this, like in our political life and the rise of specific leaders, across the political aisle who captivate much more so than even like party identity, or certainly much more than American identity. But yeah, anecdotally, I would just say that in terms of the church culture that I grew up in, I mean, I knew that the church was United Methodist, but my understanding of my own Christian faith was much more about the specific leader at our church, as well as, I would say, kind of trans-denominational evangelical figures and leaders who were offered as mentors or heroes, or if I read their books and listened to their music, or now, listen to their podcast, so to speak, that was more formative for my own self-understanding as a Christian than was the fact that I attended a United Methodist church. I didn't really know anything about United Methodist history or even Protestant. I don't know that I knew that I was a Protestant until much later. But yeah, I just anecdotally, I think that is true. And of course that, it's not a problem that we're looking for people to admire, to emulate, to look up to, especially in early formative times in our life and in our faith. But I do think it raises important questions about our commitment to institutions. I mean, at the end of the day, I'm pro-institution, because I think institutions are how cultural goods are created and sustained past the lifetime of a particular figure or generation. You need that intergenerational commitment to the institution to keep it healthy, to keep it in, going into the future. And so when we're thinking about succession plans, how difficult it can be especially if you have a very charismatic founding pastor whose identity and personality is woven into the life of the church, it can be really hard for a church community to imagine itself beyond the life or the ministry of that particular leader. And I don't think any of us want churches to die or to shrink after that person retires or passes away. So that's why this institutional identity and commitment is important, is that we need them to last beyond the lifetime of a particular person.
Yeah. So you spend quite a bit of time looking at the ministry of Billy Graham. And I'd like you to take us there because he really was sort of, there was him and Amy Semple McPherson and Billy Sunday and so on. But Billy Graham in the 20th century really was the massive Christian, the most well-known Christian. Let's just leave it there in the most neutral language possible. What because you've got some critiques for him. What, in your view, did Billy get right and did he get wrong?
Yeah, well, one thing he got right is that millions of people came to Christ because of his preaching and teaching. He understood very early on the power of the tools of mass media to reach many more people than you could just at a crusade, right? Or one-on-one. He understood that media allow us to communicate with millions of people, and he did kind of the world over. And so just thinking about the evangelistic fruit of Billy Graham's life, it's pretty massive. Like we can't even begin to imagine all the lives that were changed because of his preaching and teaching. And so I see that, very much to his credit. I would say, again, from what I know, Billy Graham was a person of integrity. There has not been a scandal to emerge since his death to, recast his legacy. There are things that I think even he would say later on, I should have done that differently. I was too bullish about this. I was naive about this. But he was a person who desired to have personal integrity and committed himself and the Evangelistic Association early on to specific safeguards around integrity and accountability and transparency. That is very much to his credit. I think he was a very likable person, I think that he really cared about people. He knew how to befriend people, both people in high places like the U.S. presidents, but also people in developing countries the world over, and would stop and take the time to minister to people one-on-one. And that feels very Jesus-like to me. I do think that, in terms of critiques, I do think that Graham was probably a bit naive about the ways that mass media shape the message that you are presenting using it. When we're thinking about television and his televised crusades, it is just the case that hearing the gospel or hearing a gospel message over that medium is going to be different from hearing it in person or in the context of a personal relationship or spiritual community. And there were ways that the work of Graham probably became too oriented around entertainment because it was given in an entertainment medium. So just a little bit of naivete around technology. I think he would have said that he probably spent too much time on the road. He was in high demand the world over. But when you think about proximity and being embedded in relationships, that requires showing up in a particular time and place over the long haul and being okay with life off the road, off the stage, off the screen. And I believe that he believed that to be his calling and that he wanted to obey God. But I think later in life, he would have said, yeah, I was too transient. I was on the road too much. I was away from my family too much. And what's my other critique of Billy Graham? I do think, going back to this individual versus institutional authority, I know that Graham and other leaders wanted people who attended crusades to get plugged into a local church. And they were doing all sorts of work to partner with local churches and point people to the church. But I do think that would have been a hard sell for a lot of crusade attenders because there was an element of spectacle and size and high emotion at a crusade. And when you think about life in the local church, it may not pale in comparison, you may then have to get to know people who really annoy you, or your pastor is probably not going to be as good of a public speaker as Billy Graham. I do think there was a way in which Graham's presentation of the gospel tended to be individualistic and focus on the relationship between the speaker and the listener, but not really embedded in a community that people were called to commit to after the crusade event. And so I think that is then missing a core component of what it means to be a Christian, because it's missing that life in the local church as the place where discipleship happens.
So this is great. This is really segues nicely into where I want to head next with the conversation. I mean, yeah, I wonder if sometimes there is an inevitability to celebrity. First of all, I'm not disagreeing with you, and particularly in 35-year-old and younger folks, I get a lot of questions all the time. And I love young leaders. Like, how do you build a platform like yours? And I'm like, well, step one, I never tried to build a platform. I just had a couple of hobbies that kind of exploded. And here we are all these years later. There wasn't a strategy. I can plot out a strategy in the rearview mirror, but it's not like I sat down with a 10-year plan. I didn't. It just kind of happened. And I think a lot of people who I know, not the people you cover in your book, but when I look at my friendship circle of people who lead some of the largest churches in America, all of them would say, I never set out. Like, yeah, I want to reach more people, but did I expect to start a 8 campus, 17 campus, 20 campus thing? I didn't intend to do that. Here we are, I'm trying to steward it well. There is almost an accidental inevitability to celebrity that I think sneaks up on a lot of people. It's just, I started something small. And I had it in a microdose too with the church that I led for 20 years. We started with literally 6 people, 14 people, 23 people at the 3 churches. We eventually amalgamated them, and it became home to 3,000 or 4,000 people. Now in the US, that's pretty normal. In Canada, that's kind of, you're an outlier. But it gave me a platform that I did not ever think would come. And you're trying to figure out how to do that. And same thing. I mean, this was a hobby 8 years ago. It was like, oh, let's see what happens if I do a podcast. And then it became what it's become. What do you do with that? Like, is there an inevitability to it? Like, you're right. Billy Graham was experimenting. I don't think he had any idea he would preach to more people than anyone in human history, including the Apostle Paul. I don't know that was in his mind. So what do you do? Just like, Billy, enough, sit down? Like, how do you handle that?
Well, I'll start by saying, of course, I understand the desire for the things that we do to make, although I hate this word, but make an impact, to reach people, to positively influence and shape people. We want the things that we do to grow. Now, I don't always know that. I think organic growth over the long haul, in the way you just described for your podcast and for your online work, is healthier and more sustainable than overnight meteoric rise success story that then, overnight I have 1 million people downloading my sermons. What do I do with that? Psychologically, that is hard to navigate. And so I would never tell somebody all growth is bad, but I would say that organic growth that comes as a natural result of you doing what you are gifted and called to do is healthier and more grounded and sustainable than I want the meteoric success and I'm going to do everything in my power to try to get it because I want to be like that guy. Of course, comparison, not a good thought, practice. I would say that if and when you find that people are starting to pay attention to what you're doing, that you start to get a following or a fan base, or, people are starting to come to your church to hear you speak. One thing that I love about Graham is that he recognized early on this kind of fame, this kind of following could really go to someone's head. I could start believing that actually I can kind of do and say what I want because I'm just that important. I'm Billy Graham. There could be a kind of hubris to develop around one's success. There could be a sense that I don't really need accountability because everybody likes and trusts me. And everybody knows that I'm kind of core to the success of what we're all trying to do. So no one's really going to say the hard thing. So there are these little ways in which once we find success or once we find that we have a platform, we can either lean into that and say, I'm really going to grasp at this and I'm going to do everything that I can to make sure this doesn't go away. And I don't want anybody to get in my way. Or there's a way of saying, ooh, I see how this could actually be really unhealthy and spiritually damaging, not just for myself, but for our community. So here are the safeguards I'm going to put in place. It could be anything from I always make sure that 80% of my ministry is with people in person and 20% is on the screen and the stage. But the vast majority of my ministry life is going to be lived among people who really know me and I really know them, and life on life. And that's how it's going to have to be to keep me grounded among real people. It could be, I got this book deal offer, or an agent, approached me wanting to represent me. Is that going to take me away from what I believe God is calling me to primarily do? When you think about the amount of time it takes to write a book, or if you are writing the book itself, maybe opportunities come to you, but you're wise and discerning about how it affects your primary calling, and not always going for the thing that's immediately going to grow your platform. Maybe God has it that your platform would grow in 5 or 10 years' time, but not in the next year or two. What's the rush, right? Kind of ultimately trusting that, my platform could rise and it could fall and it could grow and it could ebb and flow, but I have a healthy detachment from it, because I know that the platform isn't the point. The point is the work. The point is the ministry. And I trust the Lord that success could come and failure could come, and I could publish a book and there could be crickets, and it's all up to God. It's not up to me. And so I'm not looking to this to tell me that I'm a good Christian leader, that I'm worthy, that I'm valued, that I'm anointed. I'm secure in my identity in the Lord. So I don't need that external validation to know myself and to know my gifting and calling. So all of this is very spiritual and psychological, Those would be some things that I would say if somebody is kind of coming to you, Carey, and asking, okay, what do I do? I'm never going to tell somebody having a platform is bad. I mean, that would be very hypocritical of me, right? But it is to say, why do you want a platform? What do you expect to get from the platform? What do you want to do with it? How will it affect the other elements of your life and ministry? It's becoming discerning before stepping into the world of platforms, because of the temptations that could come if by chance you actually become very successful and turn out to be a celebrity figure.
There's so much I agree with you on those points. I think those are really good points. And there's a grounding that happens even if you have a big platform. And the best leaders I know do that extremely well. But you've hinted at something a couple times, both in your critique of Billy Graham, and also you said, am I spending 80% of my time with people and maybe 20% of people on video, et cetera, et cetera. So what's interesting about that is, does that mean that you would categorically preclude digital ministry? There is the rise of totally online church. Obviously, technology is not getting smaller, it's getting bigger. And Billy Graham did that in a totally different forum. And if you think about it, I thought about mentioning this earlier, but I have a friend who once said, and this is his theory, it was sort of tongue-in-cheek, but I think he actually has a point. He said, if you look at the development of the early church in the book of Acts, Peter's supposed to run the whole thing. And Peter's like, well, Jews, Gentiles, I don't know. Should I go to your house? And God has to send an angel, to go to Cornelius's house. And then one day, Jesus kind of goes, you know what? We need someone else. And knocks a guy named Saul off of his horse. And the Apostle Paul is born. And in many ways was a first century Billy Graham. I mean, he went from town to town, country to country, nation to nation, and never married, didn't have family, had some travel companions, but broke up with Barnabas and, took other people along with him, Silas and some others. You could say, Paul wasn't rooted in community. He did all of his work on the road. And the reason that you and I grew up in churches can be directly traced back to the work of the Apostle Paul. It is perhaps it would not have worked out the way it worked out had Saul not been knocked off his horse. So, and I'm thinking another case study in our generation, Mike's been on the podcast a couple of times, but Michael Todd at Transformation Church in Tulsa, Oklahoma, young African-American 30-year-old pastor, preaches this sermon. They got 400 people. It goes viral on Twitter and then on Instagram. And he did literally wake up with 1 million people watching a message that 200 people had heard the week before. And he didn't ask for that. He just had good cameras, and I've interviewed him about what that does to your head and everything. But like when that happens, do you how do you steward that? Are you saying like, this is 100% virtual company? I don't, I got real people running it, and I meet with leaders on the road all the time, and 100,000 people will hear this interview or whatever. But those are real people. Like, is it invalid to do digital ministry? What if your digital ministry becomes bigger than your in-person ministry? Those are real questions, I think, for this age, and I'd love your take on it. That was sort of rambly, but you see where I'm coming from.
Well, a couple thoughts. When we're talking about itinerant work, itinerant evangelism, traveling, as Paul did, traveling all over the globe as Billy Graham did. I think of those as very powerful, but very specific exceptions to the norm. Which is to say, yes, it probably is the case that you and I are both Christians today because of the work of the Apostle Paul. And also the reason that we know about the Apostle Paul is because most people aren't like the Apostle Paul.
Right, exactly.
He was a pretty unique figure in human history, in church history. And when I think about my growth as a Christian over my lifetime, and when I think about what has shaped me most deeply, maybe not had the most immediate and memorable impact early on, but what really has shaped me and actually kept me a Christian are the normal Christian people like my family, like my parents, who are a Midwestern couple who have stayed committed to one another for 40 years, have lived in the same house for 30 years, have attended the same church for 25 years. These are like the saltiest of the earth people you can imagine. But the diffuse effect of their life, of their love for the Lord and others, maybe we can't point to it and say, well, overnight, Tim and Katelyn Beaty went viral. But I truly believe that ordinary faithfulness lived out in the lives of people off the screen and off the stage has an incalculable effect for the kingdom. And so I think I would say, no, it's not that it's bad that Michael Todd went viral overnight. But how are we measuring kingdom fruit? And it can't always be tracked by number of hits, number of downloads.
YouTube views.
Yeah, because I've listened to hundreds of podcasts and, read plenty of books by thoughtful Christian leaders. But when I think about, and that's all great, I think that all of that mediated content can play a very important role in people's lives. But when I actually think about what has had the deepest effect in keeping me a Christian, it is one-on-one, person-to-person contact with other Christians who are loving Jesus and others very well. So that would be one thing I would say. In terms of digital worship and digital work, of course, we are in a time when we recognize that these tools help us connect with people that we can't connect with in person. I have worked remotely in my day-to-day job for the last 4.5 years and have not really been able to see my colleagues very much. And gosh, 2 years ago was so immensely grateful for the wonders of FaceTime to talk with my family when I couldn't see them. And so virtual, digital, yes, these are all instruments that we can use as an expression of what God is calling us to do. And that goes for church as well. On the point of church, though, I would say I live in a place where churches were actually not allowed to gather for a time during COVID. And then kind of, the restrictions loosened and I started attending a church in person. We had all these precautions around it, but there was nothing that watching a Zoom service, a Zoom worship service could ever have approximated in the real. I say real, as what's happening online real. Well, yes, it is real, but it in my experience, it does not approximate what happens in person among other people. We are embodied creatures. We are flesh and blood, and God made us to connect with each other in that way, to gather in that way. And so it strikes me as well, when we're thinking about the early church, Paul might have been traveling and he had travel companions, but he was also encouraging people to meet, to keep meeting in person, keep breaking bread together, keep inviting more in. And no, we're not going to go back to the first century church model anytime soon, but I think there's something there that we can learn from. Paul wasn't saying, and then come be like me, all of you also become itinerant preachers. He was saying, continue to meet and gather and remember Christ crucified and care for the vulnerable in your midst. So that strikes me. And I think that a lot of our neighbors are hungry for that, because we spend so much time in front of screens week in and week out, or we're actually we're hungry for in-person connection. And can churches offer that, in a unique way that meets the needs and loneliness of our neighbors?
So I want to switch gears a little bit. You outline 3 temptations in the book that seem to succumb most of us in leadership seem to apply to most of us in leadership in this digital age. You talk about abusing power, chasing platforms, and creating personas. Can you unpack each of those a little bit and what you mean by them? Because I thought they were very helpful categories.
Yeah, these are 3 temptations. Abusing power is pretty straightforward, but I think of celebrity as a kind of power, an interpersonal power over others. And these are the headlines we've seen, in the last few years, where someone gets to a kind of elevated status and then uses that to harm others or to get their way. Chasing platforms, I'm writing as someone who works full-time in the Christian book publishing industry. And I talk a lot in my book about the ascendancy of the platform question in Christian book publishing. And of course, as we've already touched on, it's not that platforms are bad. And I understand the financial and marketing realities of publishing and selling a book. And I have seen over time the ways that platform kind of crowds out other really important considerations and starts to it's essentially putting the cart before the horse, where someone is building a platform for a book that they're not even sure they want to write. It's like the platform is the point, or they can write. I don't think everybody is called.
I've gotten those books. Yeah, trust me. There's a difference between a real book and those books.
Yes, thank you for saying what I didn't feel confident saying.
No, you can be confident. I get shipped books every day, and I'm like, why is this a book?
Why is this a book?
What is going on here? I don't get it. And then you read other books and it's like, oh, this needed to be a book. Like you had to get these ideas.
This is an actual book.
This is an actual book. You had to get that idea out to other humans, but it's like books for the sake of books, or I'll take this half-digested sermon series and turn it into a 42,000 word book. I'm like, I don't know that the world needs one more of those, but
I'm so glad you're saying all of this.
Are you? Okay. I'm allowed to say that.
Yeah. Yes. But, going back to things we've already talked about, just a kind of mismatch of priorities and chasing platforms becoming the main thing rather than a byproduct of good work and good ministry. And the final temptation is creating persona. And persona is a way of talking about the ways that we, show up in public, that we show up in our roles, in our responsibilities. People look to us. And I think a lot of pastors experience a lot of pressure to show up in a particular way as a leader in the church. And they find that they're kind of performing a role for other people to kind of hold things together. And over time, there's this gap between their persona and their private and interior life. Like, you know, I appear successful. I appear to be the smartest person in the room. I always have to have the right answers. I appear to be the one who's going to carry our organization into success. And then behind closed doors, I'm struggling. I have doubts. I don't know who I can have an honest conversation with. Does anybody really know me? Does anybody care to know me? And also this pressure is taking a toll on my health, on my relationships, on my marriage, so that gap, you know, between the persona and the person it can be very isolating, painful. And I think that's where so many of the problems of celebrity that we've read about start to creep is in that disconnect.
I think that's a really helpful distinction. And I think most people who have put on a microphone to speak on a Sunday morning, even if it's to 150 people or 50 people, have felt that pressure in one way or the other. Let's talk about solutions a little bit. So in an article that you wrote, and we'll link to it in the show notes, you know, I wasn't sure that you were saying when a megachurch pastor fails that there is a path to restoration. It's interesting. I asked Tim Keller this question recently, and his answer was, actually, I don't know that you can go back to the same job. Like if you're guilty of a serious moral breach as a pastor, I think you can do something else with your life, but I'm not sure you get that pastoral platform back, which I thought was a really interesting answer. Gordon MacDonald, on the other hand, in his book, Rebuilding Your Private World, has a whole path set out for pastoral restoration that I thought was actually also very persuasive. What is your take on, because unfortunately we see those headlines way more often than anybody wants to. These are real stories with real broken hearts and congregations that feel like their trust is betrayed, families in tatters, victims, you know, reeling from what happened. Is there a process for restoration if a pastor fails morally?
So I'm thinking about the work of Chuck DeGroat, who is a pastoral care expert and counselor and has met with hundreds of pastors in his work. And I interviewed him for my book, and we talked about this precise question because, you know, in many cases, he's meeting with pastors who have had some kind of moral failure, who have been asked to step out of the spotlight, who are, you know, facing discipline. And they come to Chuck asking, okay, like, what do I need to do? What do I need to do?
How do I get back? Yeah.
Yes. How do I get back? Not everybody, of course, but that there's a tendency to, gosh, this is really uncomfortable. And so much of my sense of self and identity is about being a pastor. And it feels really good to be a pastor. And I just want to get back to where I was. And something that Chuck says and told me is that he counsels 10 years out of the spotlight. And that very few people take him up on it. Because 10 years, at least to me, feels like a really long time. I mean,
an eternity. Yeah.
What am I going to do for the next 10 years? If my training, my career training has been oriented around ministry, do I go work at a bank? I mean, there's something in having to take normal work, quote unquote, that I think can feel really humiliating or disorienting. But I really trust Chuck on this because he says that is the amount of time it takes to address the deep-rooted wounds and tendencies and temptations and personality dynamics that led to the problems in the first place. And so let's take the time to get those sorted out, to get health for you and your family, to make sure that if there's hurt people, that there is a path to real repentance, not quick repentance, but kind of real rebuilding of trust. And all of this stuff takes time. And so I would never say, of course, that pastors who have failed can't be forgiven. That of course is a non-negotiable. And I do think that there can be a path back to some form of public ministry if the person is willing to take at least 10 years. And my concern is that the pastors who are coming in to Chuck's office and people like them, what they have in mind as the goal is getting back rather than I want to heal. I want to practice repentance and heal.
Good distinction.
It's the wanting
That's
to get back.
helpful.
And whatever hoops I have to jump through to get there. And that is not the goal. That is not the goal.
I'm less sorry for my sin, more sorry that I got caught and it cost me. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's
right.
a very helpful distinction. I'm going to remember that. You also tackle profits a little bit. And, if you think about it, denominations are not what they used to be. And they don't have the funding. Institutions like seminaries, et cetera, not what they used to be. And yet everything from book deals to Christian music to other things are big issues. I'd love to get your take because, obviously the church needs money to function. There's no question. And I believe the worker is worth his or her wages. And churches should be fair employers and pay a living wage. But yeah, there are excesses for sure. I think it was Tony Morgan who told me, the church is one of extremes. You're either broke or you make too much money. Where's the middle? And I think that's a really good thought about that. What are some of the challenges with money in the church these days from your standpoint, Katelyn?
One challenge is that we don't really talk about it in any, we talk about it in terms of stewardship and generosity.
Yeah.
But we don't talk about specific budgetary items. I don't know. I guess I could go look it up if I really wanted to or ask for it. I don't know what my pastor makes. I have not known what other pastors in my life or church leaders have made. So some of this is about transparency, and some of this is about churches being willing to be held accountable by the people in the church. And I grant that different churches are going to have different senses, kind of culturally and theologically about what's appropriate for a pastor to earn and what is inappropriate. So my role is not to say, if you make more than this as a pastor, you're a bad pastor.
Here's the line. Don't cross it.
I have my own hunches, but I'm very sensitive to, this is very contextual and has to be discerned, within a community. I will say there's a difference between earning a particular amount of money and wanting others to know that you make that much money. And this is where we get into opulence and lavish spending.
Your clothes,
right. And a kind of mismatch between basic Christian concepts of humility and a flashiness. I want to be noticed. I want people to be impressed by me. There are all sorts of ways that we can kind of flash our wealth or be more mindful and humble about it. And so I think when we're talking about profits in the church, one of my first questions is, does this church leader want me to think that he's rich? Whether or not he is actually rich by kind of American standards, does he want me to know that he's rich? And if he does, I'm concerned. And perhaps I'm especially concerned if he's not in fact rich and he's just spending money in a really poor way to try to appear impressive and flashy and, attract wealthy people to the church. So yeah, I think a lot of this comes down to humility. I'm thinking, again, back to Tim Keller. I don't know what he makes or what he has made as a pastor. New York City is a notoriously expensive place to live. I do know that Tim Keller and his wife have lived in the same apartment for like 25 or 30 years. It's not in a posh part of the city. He doesn't dress or present in such a way that makes me think, oh, wow, he's
Very down to earth. Yeah.
Very down to earth. And that is refreshing to me to see that, especially with pastors,
Yeah. So what do you do? I mean, you've written a book or two, and my books have not hit the New York Times bestseller list, and but inevitably at some point somebody writes a book or somebody has something that goes viral or sells a lot of copies. Mm-hmm. What do you do if it sells 1 million copies? I mean, that's a lot of money. I interviewed James Clear earlier this year. His book has sold 10 million copies. Mine not even close. But I mean, there's a certain point at which, what's your advice to somebody listening who's like, well, I have money and money I wasn't, let's say they're not even chasing celebrity. Let's just say they wrote, I mean, my book hasn't come close to the New York Times. Well, it came close, but you know what I mean? Like I'm not in that category, but, and we all kind of secretly wish it would, don't we, Katelyn? Let's just be honest. Let's get it out there. So that would be fun. That would be nice. But,
yeah. I mean, gosh, wouldn't it be terribly ironic if I came on here and was like, I wrote a book where I decry platforms and celebrity, but I really want that book to hit the New York Times bestseller list.
Yes. And then this is the interview that pushes it onto the New York Times bestseller list.
This is going to be the key.
I'm just joking around. This is the key. No, but like again, back to my point earlier, a lot of the people I know and I hang out with, they write books because they have an idea to communicate. And do we all hope, as you said, it will sell well? Yeah, of course. I mean, I would rather, and you say this in your book, you'd rather have someone read your book than nobody read your book. Like there's that real tension. You're not sitting there going, I hope this flops and Baker loses its shirt on this book. Like no author has ever thought that. And
I'm actually the first author who wants their book to fail. It's just little humble brag.
Just integrity wise, right? I need this to fail. I need this to not go well. No, but you know what I'm talking about. Like I'm talking about the dilemma that a lot of us, like nobody wants to stink. If 10,000 people hear this message, that would be better than 10 people hearing this message. We're all caught in that kind of trap. So what do you do if you accidentally or with a bit of good fortune succeed?
Yeah, what a great question. I don't know what that's like. I mean, I know what it's like to want a book to succeed, and I know what it's like to look at sales numbers, and I know what it's like to check the Amazon rankings. And I will say, shortly after Celebrities for Jesus came out, the first month after it came out was not a fun time at all. I was just so struck by how much psychologically I had writing on the line, and how terrible that was. Katelyn, you wrote a book. I think it's a pretty good book. People are saying this is really helpful. This is really something that the church could benefit from. And I'm here looking at numbers, and I'm looking at what my friends' numbers are, and I'm comparing, and I feel discouraged. And this can't be right. This just can't be. This is not healthy. There's something at work here that is unhealthy. I'm unhealthily or unduly attached to the success of this. And so just in some conversations with friends and going to actually like a spiritual retreat center where I was speaking and I was going in just thinking this is a professional thing. And then God met me there in an amazing way. It freed me, actually. It freed me from the anxiety and the obsession with what's going to happen with this. So I'm just reflecting on what happens if your book doesn't hit the bestseller list. If it does hit the bestseller list, I mean, I would say celebrate, I would say, you want your ideas and your thoughts and your message to connect with people and to touch lives and to change hearts and minds. And none of us would be in the world of communication if that weren't true. I would say there are probably, regarding the financial picture, serious conversations to be had about how this will and will not change your life. I'm thinking about Rick Warren, and, I'm confident in saying neither of us will probably have purpose-driven lifestyle meteoric rise, because that's like
50 million copies. No,
it just seems unlikely. I mean, I don't want to.
Yeah, I would say probably not.
But I remember that he publicly committed to he and his wife, Kay, commit to a reverse tithe, giving away 90%, keeping 10%. Now, that's still a lot of money. 10% on
of a lot.
10% of the royalties of a book that sells 50 million copies is still a lot of money. But I thought of that as just one step that a leader who has had massive success, one step to say, yeah, we could really live into this, but we're going to put some boundaries and safeguards around our spending as a way to honor the way that God has blessed us and to recognize this is all God's anyway. Like, success or failure, it all belongs to God. So some of this just gets back to a spirit of generosity that flows out from our understanding of what God in Christ has done for us. I'm also thinking, of course, about Eugene Peterson, who had a lot of success with the Message transliteration of the Bible. My understanding is that he did not write that to get on the bestseller list. It was something that he started writing and playing with actually to minister to people in his church who found the language of scripture boring. And he thought, how could I rephrase this in a way that would really grab people's attention and keep them engaged? And then, of course, comes this massive bestseller and a beautiful, beautiful rendering of scripture. And I think at that point, any of us would have probably said to Eugene Peterson, like, you can probably retire. I mean, you don't have to do this like pastoring stuff. Like, gosh, the work of pastoring and sitting with people in their pain, and gosh, people can be so annoying, and like, you should just enjoy this new era of your life where you don't need to pastor anymore because you are set for life because of this massive bestseller. And instead, he chose to keep pastoring. It was almost like, yeah, I had success and I'm grateful for that. But what's most important are the people who I'm called to shepherd. And that's I know that that's my primary work, and I'm going to stay there. And that just seems so countercultural that, in fact, I don't think most Christians would take that path. It is truly the path less traveled. But gosh, what a witness that is, that kind of choices in the midst of success.
So quick side note to podcast listeners, we'll link to it in the show notes. But yeah, the origin story of the Message and some of his journey about why he kept pastoring is on this podcast in an earlier episode with Eugene Peterson. And then I think the update, I spent the better part of a day with Rick Warren last year. And I think he's now giving away over 98% of everything. And he still doesn't have his Ford Red Ranger, but I drove in his car on the way to the shoot for the podcast. And it looks like anything any suburban parent would drive to soccer on a weekend. It's fascinating. I think it was a Ford. But yeah, those are really good examples. And I'm glad, as much as we could just focus on all the people who've fallen, to focus on some people who appear, from everything we can tell on the outside looking in based on what we know, to be doing it well in our generation. Katelyn, this has been super, super helpful. I appreciate the nuance. I appreciate the wrestling and what you shared earlier about, I was disappointed when my book didn't sell what I thought it would. It is a real book. It's a good book. And I do hope that people pick this up. But that's why you understand the mind of a pastor. Of course, we all hope that more people are going to hear our message. Of course, we all hope for more people this Sunday than we had last Sunday. Of course, we all hope that more people are going to listen to this episode rather than less people. Like, there is that inherent human desire. And I'm not sure that's all from Satan. I think what really, I'd love to read a psychological profile of the Apostle Paul. That would be fascinating. What was really driving that guy? I don't know. But God used it. He really used it.
Yeah, that's really well said. And we all want fruit. We all want to know that our work matters and is connecting. And it feels good when something is connecting and we can see it in a real tangible way. I think a reframe for me, and perhaps for your listeners, is thinking about fruit as something that can't always be measured, can't always be seen on a graph or a chart, can't always be seen in book sales, but believing that God honors our good work and our desire to serve him and his people, and ultimately trusting him with the results.
And a really good question to ask too, and you raised this in the context of Eugene Peterson, but like, what would you do if you didn't have to work anymore? I found that a very interesting question because I've interviewed a lot of people here who could have retired a long time ago. Not everybody, but more than a fair share of people who could have been like, yeah, I got enough bank just to coast or whatever. And I've been most inspired by the people who are like, money's secondary. Let's do some good work, not to make more money, but to give back, to make a difference, to make an impact. That word you're not a huge fan of, but I think it's still got a little bit of legs left. Any final words, Katelyn, for people as they struggle with it? And again, thank you for your work. It was really meaningful to me, and I hope people do pick up the book. And I think it's an important contribution to the moment and the dialogue we're in right now.
Well, thank you so much for your thoughtful engagement with it, Carey, for not a bestseller book. You're paying attention to the. I really appreciate.
Otherwise, I wouldn't have asked you. Yeah.
Yeah, and I really appreciate the points of pushback you offered, or kind of like, okay, but for real, like, let's talk about numbers. Let's talk about platform. What do you do? Because I recognize that as someone who is not in pastoral ministry and is mostly observing it from the outside as a writer and journalist, it could be easy for me to say, pastors shouldn't make any more than X amount, or no pastor should ever have a platform, or we should never do virtual church. And I think so much of this is contextual and based in discernment and wisdom. And so I trust that more people will find this book and find ways to apply its broader principles to their own specific context that nonetheless resists the temptations of celebrity gone wrong that we've seen so clearly in the last several years.
Well, it's an important contribution, I think, to the dialogue. I just want to thank you so much for saying yes, and thanks for writing the book and for the work you're doing, and be encouraged and keep asking really important questions. We need those questions to be asked, and we need your voice in this debate. So Katelyn, where can people find you online? Obviously the book, Celebrities for Jesus, anywhere you get your books, but where can they track with you these days?
The best place to go is KatelynBeaty.com. I have a list of articles and essays, as well as podcast interviews I've done there. I do have some speaking engagements coming up in 2023, and you can find all of my social media information there. If you want to drop me a line, I get mail, both fan mail and critical mail through the website. So if you're so inspired, I'd love to hear from you. But KatelynBeaty.com is a great place to start.
Katelyn, thank you so much for this conversation. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for hosting it.